live. Here we are. All right, Scott Peck, welcome back.
Good to see you again.
Great to see you. You can shake my hands, okay.
Right.
I was giving you a bow because that was basically thank you for not doing the I told you so on camera. Right before we went live, I was like, this is a nice guy. Steve would never do that.
Just so you know, Derek has never bowed to me in all the years that I've been on the
Steve
show.
Ploetz is here.
I don't know what they're talking about.
That's okay. He and I have, an ongoing feud. So, when does it make sense to buy a home considering new tax laws? That's, part of the reason why you're here, Scott. You're a CPA, and you're familiar with the new tax laws, and things changed.
Oh yeah, quite a
with
bit.
regard to home ownership. Last time you were here, we sort of talked about, hey, is this going to happen? Are these tax laws going to get passed? We didn't think, or I didn't think that there was any way that they would be able to chip away at anything that had to do with the mortgage deduction because of the fact that the real estate lobby is so strong and so heavy. But needless to say, there has been maybe a few chips taken away.
Some significant changes, quite a bit of significant changes, and even more so with property taxes. That's an even more drastic change than the real estate mortgage interest deduction. That's a huge change, and that has more of an impact on homeownership, I think, than some of the mortgage interest changes, and we can talk about that as well. So probably the best thing to do would be for you to ask questions, and I can give you the best answers I can. I still believe in homeownership, and that's not, and folks, they told me not that I didn't have to take any kind of position, I wasn't coached or anything. I always tell my clients, even though my job is taxes, quality of life is the first consideration you make when you're making a financial decision, and taxes are just a small part of the equation. So you want to make sure that that you take a look at all things considered, like, do I want to continue to pay rent? There's really very little financial benefit to paying rent and then walking away from something after 10 years. Do you want to have something that you can remodel the way you want to remodel? Those are things that you can't put a tax significance to. So
certain things are hard to quantify the value of, right? That's the hard part about trying to discern between, does it make sense for us to rent in this community or buy in this community where we can afford it? We might be able to rent in a, let's say, a nicer community than we can afford to buy in. Right. Because even though rents have gone up a lot, once you get to like $1 million house or like $1.5 million house, the rent dollar to home value ratio goes down a lot. It just does. And so you can rent like $1 million house for $3 grand. Whereas if you buy that place, you're talking about 20% down, that's $200,000, plus your payment's gonna be like $5-6 grand. Yeah. It looks like on paper like it's a much more expensive venture. So we have to look at, what are the things to consider first of all. Yeah. And a quick story to share about this is, a friend of mine who lives in Chula Vista, and his daughters go to school in La Jolla.
wow.
Now they said, well, we can only afford to own in Chula Vista. That's why we bought, because we wanted to own something. I said, that makes sense. It does. It makes sense. When did you guys buy? 2011. Great job.
Right.
Yeah.
Great job. But now let's take a look at the totality of the circumstances you have going on here. Let's talk about how you're in your car for almost 4 hours a day, how your children are in the car with you for almost 4 hours a day, all the driving around you're doing for practices, the schools, and Chula Vista, and the traffic. Let's talk about the cost of that. Let's talk about, all of those things that are going on. Does it make sense? When you add all that up, you got to look at everything. How much does it cost me to do it this way versus that way? And then if you've added time into the equation, like in their case, they're spending a lot of time commuting, then you have to, if there's a surplus, you say, okay, well, how much am I getting paid for my time? How much am I getting paid to drive my kids around? And that'll help you gauge where the value is. If you're getting paid $2 an hour to drive your kids around, it may not be worth it. That's assuming there's a surplus, then there may not be. So I think, Steve, as I'll give you the microphone here, there's a lot of things to consider.
Absolutely.
It's not just, this payment versus that payment.
And to Scott's point, I don't think that there is rare times where it is clear cut, like, yes, this makes sense, no, this does not make sense. There's advantages and disadvantages to both purchasing and renting. As we've talked about, the benefits of renting are, it's easy to move. You can get out. Now, granted, right now we're in a seller's market, but we've seen some shifting within the market. So when you're renting, end of your lease, I'm done, I want to walk away. Something breaks in my house and I'm renting, make a phone call.
Not my problem.
Not my problem. Come out and get it fixed. I would say, as you alluded to, the real estate market is challenging the rental market is stupid right now. I mean, it's very difficult. People are paying, hey, I'll pay 6 months up front, and there's no guarantee at the end of that lease, even if you're going to stay, that your payment is going to remain the same. Whereas when you purchase, assuming that you're in a fixed product mortgage, you know what that payment's going to be for your entire life. I mean, if you've got impounds, property taxes that are within there, things can change slightly. But you know within the realm. There isn't the, I'm dependent upon someone else, and all of a sudden things are going to go up. I don't know your friend that's in Chula Vista, but most people would say, looking back on it, yes, 4 hours a day or whatever it is, made up numbers that you've rounded to so your algorithm looks better. If he purchased in 2011 and
the war began.
If he purchased in 2011, here comes the first of many
First
missiles.
torpedo. All right. Okay.
If he purchased in 2011 and now it's 2018, I don't think there are very many people that say that was a bad idea. Now, had he purchased in 2007 or near the peak of the market, as long as that payment has been comfortable, as we've talked about, my opinion, if he's been able to make that payment, he's paying down principal, he's getting some of the tax benefits, which have changed. But in most cases, assuming the idea is jump in, buy, and hold it for a long period of time, your friend has spent a lot of money in gas. He's spent a fair amount of time in the car. He's also made a huge profit.
He's made a massive profit.
Well, maybe I should tell your viewers how the laws have changed a little bit.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you is, so there's two things that people typically look at, which is the mortgage interest deduction, right? You also can deduct a couple little things like closing costs, a couple things there, and but you also could write off your property taxes.
Right.
Which was, so you add all those things together and it starts to pile up a nice chunk of deduction. So what's changed with those few things?
Well, significantly, a lot has changed. Let's first talk about, there's a division between people who purchased their home or at least got into a mortgage prior to December 31st of last year, and those who are getting into a mortgage after January 1st of this year. So for those who already purchased their home, let me give you a sigh of relief here. If your mortgage is, if your acquisition indebtedness, and I'll put that into English now, if the money that you borrowed to purchase or improve your home totals $1 million or less, nothing's changed. You get to deduct 100% of that interest.
Okay, so that's the amount you borrowed, not the purchase price.
That's the amount that you borrowed, not the purchase price. So you could have paid $3 million for your home, put $2 million down, you financed $1 million. 100% of that, of the interest on that loan is still deductible. Let's say you have a loan for $750,000 and an equity loan, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more, for another $250,000, and all $250,000 of that was to, say, put in a pool, install solar, and do other things, improve the property, thank you. Then 100% of that, even though they say equity indebtedness is no longer deductible, which is true, not they say, that is the actual truth, it's that part, that equity indebtedness is still deductible. With the IRS, or Congress defines as equity indebtedness, is not the same as what you and I define as equity indebtedness. So that's still deductible. Now for after January 1st, that number decreases to $750,000. That's the primary interest change. Now let me throw in, for those of you who own rental properties, for those of you who own commercial property, nothing at all has changed. You could own a $3 million commercial property and owe 250. Did I say 300?
Yeah, $3 million,
$2.5 million in debt. Yeah. That's all deductible. We're talking strictly residential real estate. That is all.
Where the changes have come about. Which
so,
my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Scott, is that the changes have come from both a primary residence and what's considered a secondary residence. So if I had a second home that is in San Francisco, that would also fit under these new laws. But investment properties, whether it's condos, residential, multifamily, those are nothing has changed. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. Now with property taxes, that's drastically changed. Now the most you can deduct, and you've heard the acronym, or that was thrown around a lot in December when we were watching the news. SALT, state and local taxes. That's state income taxes, property taxes, DMV registration fees, etc. The limit that you can deduct on that in aggregate, whether you're married, single, is $10,000. So if you have a job where your state income taxes that are withheld come to, say, $8,000, and then the real estate taxes on your residence is another $9,000, that's $17,000 total. The most you're able to deduct, whereas you used to be able to deduct all $17,000, the most you can deduct on that is $10,000. You lose the other $7,000.
And I believe that the median household price in San Diego County, I want to say it's like $562. So if we figure $562 with property taxes of 1.1% or so,
right.
A typical homeowner is going to have around $6,000 in property taxes annually,
right.
Which gives you only $4,000 more, you're saying?
Right, exactly.
For the remaining.
Right, so that's going to have an
It feels like you're
impact.
on Derek's side right now.
A whole bunch of wild rounding going on that side of the table.
Well,
this side of the room is making numbers
numbers
up right now.
Yeah, it's a.
Let me ask you this, Steve. Has it deterred you? Because this is actually kind of crafty. I mean, the way that these tax changes have been rolled out, the idea was, hey, people are really getting a lot of advantages to this. We don't really need to encourage homeownership this much because the market's so good, the economy's so good, people are buying houses, there's low inventory everywhere. We don't need these handouts anymore for people to buy homes. I think that was the idea. Let's pull back some of that money, leave it with the government. The question is, has it discouraged anyone? Have tax changes made anyone look at it and go, you know what, it doesn't pencil anymore?
No, and I would say a bigger deterrent for people has been a change in their monthly payment, as we've seen a bump in the interest rates. So I would say that, interestingly, many homeowners, surprising a larger number than you would think about, in my opinion, don't look at the tax benefits of homeownership, at least in the residential market. A lot of them, from my experience, are looking more about roof over their head, school districts, payments that make sense, how does this compare to me renting? And those numbers, the tax side, I would say, has not influenced anybody in such a significant way, because of looking at those numbers, if the median price is $562 and we're talking about somebody has property taxes of about $6,000, they're going to cap out at 10, but for most people, it's not like they would have had $50,000 of write-offs and now they're only getting 10. Scott knows more about, in terms of those sides, how many people that's actually really affecting. But I would say, in his example, the number was 17,000 and it goes to 10. So $7,000 in tax write-offs is significant, but it's not enough to make, my opinion, it's not enough to tip the scale. It's not a tipping.
And that's what I've always wondered, because I feel like people, when they don't go do the math first and see, well, what is the actual tax benefit? They just sort of know it's a cherry on the top.
Absolutely.
We know we want to own a home. We know we want to live in this area. We can afford this much home. We've been pre-qualified. And we get tax benefits. You know, they don't really look into it and go, the tax benefits are going to make our effective interest rate this, and they don't go that far for the most part. It's just sort of like a cherry on the top. Well, we get tax benefit.
Absolutely. I think it's a great descriptor.
Well, and I get that a lot every year when I have a new homeowner prior to this law change. There's at least one or two people that are very disappointed when they get their taxes and they're expecting huge money back, or they're expecting to see their taxes go down because, wait a minute, but we own a home now. Yeah. That's supposed to change everything. It's like, well, not really. I mean, a lot of it has to do with other things and how much should you have withheld, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot more to it. What we haven't mentioned, and this is not supposed to be a show about the tax reform, but another component to all of this is that while those deductions have changed, the standard deductions have gone up significantly. That's supposed to compensate, and I would disagree with you that the motivation was to penalize homeowners, or we've given them too much before and we don't need to subsidize this anymore. I think it was more along the line of it was supposed to be simplification. And why should everybody have to come pay somebody like me to do their taxes just because they own a home? Make it more simple to do your taxes if all it is that you own a home, and so to do that, what they did is they increased the standard deduction, But they also did take away personal exemptions. So we can go on and on like this.
Well, the increase of the standard deduction is for other areas, I think, of the country.
Well, that's the other thing. Then you can get into red states versus blue states, and not everybody in the world has a median house price of $562,000, which is insane.
Don't use Steve's numbers off the top of his head, because if you start quoting that stuff,
let's face it. No, when you cannot attract, I have clients that cannot attract employees here, and they're offering them huge money, but the employees will not come here because they can't afford to buy houses, and they're moving to other places in the country that are paying them also nice salaries, but not the kinds of salaries that they're being offered here, but they can at least afford to buy a house, and that's what they want to do. That's really bad for our social environment.
Absolutely. The affordability index has changed significantly. I saw more studies of numbers that all round, which talked about that the minimum wage requirement for someone to rent in San Diego County a 2-bedroom apartment, they need to be making like $22 an hour. That's difficult.
It's more than I make.
Well, that's just because you put in so many damn hours.
Well, and I saw a countrywide graph about that as well, and the state of California is definitely the most expensive on that list. Or no, maybe it was New York, but it was way up there. It was like over $30 an hour on average. Now you're taking on average, you're including San Francisco and San Jose and some of the Silicon Valley areas where it's probably way more than that. But that's crazy. So like, here's the thing. So when does it make sense to buy a home? Considering the new tax laws, it sounds to me, based on the subject of this, that the new tax laws really don't have a huge impact. It's a small impact, right? It's not a massive change.
It should not be, especially in most areas of the country.
It's not going to be a deal breaker.
I would not think so. Not at this stage of the game.
Okay.
I mean, it's hard to say. We haven't actually lived under the new laws yet, but I don't believe so.
Okay. So if the tax laws aren't going to be a game changer, then the core of the question is, when does it make sense to buy a home? And that is a much more difficult question, I think, that people, and I would highly recommend, in fact, that if you are going to buy a home, that you figure out what all those things are ahead of time. I mean, look at everything. Look at drives. What's the commute to work look like? What's the commute to school, the commute to practice, or the club that, everyone's playing club sports these days, so people are driving all over the place. It used to be, you'd leave your kids at school, they go to school, and then afterwards they have practice. There, the same spot. It's not like that anymore. So look at those things. Look at how much time you're going to spend in the car. Look at how much time you're going to drive. Look at what your tax advantages are.
I completely agree, Derek, and I think that also the style of home ownership has changed. My parents have lived in the same house since 1979. However, they certainly say these days that the average time that someone is in a home is 5 to 7 years. That also can impact. We've talked about what's happening in the market and how it is a seller's market and how likely this can't continue forever. Nobody knows exactly when that change is going to be. But if looking ahead in 5 to 7 years, if things have changed, how does that look? I spoke with a client today about, he's in escrow, and the discussion was, should he do an adjustable rate mortgage or a fixed mortgage? Yikes. And the discussion is, well, you can get some teaser here that then you hope that things continue in the way that they've been going, or you can know for sure what your payment is going to be, and you don't need to worry about what's going to happen in the future. So to your point, what I would say is, I highly recommend figure out what's it cost to rent, and what are the other things that go involved in it, and what happens if I purchase a property. And speaking to your CPA and your lender about getting those numbers is so critical at the beginning, because inevitably what I find, a lot of people just jump in and go, well, we've heard that home ownership is a good thing, is the American dream. We're going to do it. We need a roof over our head anyways. We're having a baby. We're getting married. Let's do it. And I think that people need to do it the way that you're mentioning, which is crunch numbers.
Well, you have to look at the reality of what you're doing. I mean, what you're actually doing is you're hedging a real estate market when you buy a home. That's what you're doing. You're locking in the price at this point. Here's my payment for the next 30 years, and then this thing is mine, and I have no more payments. It's a hedge. The trouble with renting is that you're sort of flapping in the wind. That's the downside to renting. It's like year by year, what's going to happen? They're going to increase the rent $100 this year or $200.
Right.
or $300.
Or is the landlord going to decide they want to sell the property?
Yeah, you got to go.
Yeah.
So you have lack of control there. So when you buy a home, what you're really doing is you're hedging. You're saying, this is my cost. I can afford this much. I feel comfortable paying this much for 30 years. And then once that's done, you're really set, right? Like if you do nothing else in your financial life but own a home free and clear, if that's the only thing you accomplish in your entire financial life, then you're going to be okay. Like stuff's going to work out. Like that's the big problem. Yeah. When you talk about retirement and you look at things and you talk to people in their mid-60s and they have a 30-year mortgage that they're 3 years into, that's a much bigger hill to climb than like what your parents probably did. They lived in the house since what, 1979 you said, or something like that. So the house has probably been paid off for a while. I know my dad paid his house off 7-8 years ago. He just retired last year. Yeah. Right, you're going to be fine. You're great if you have a paid off home. So that's the point. You hedge the market. I'm going to pay this much, and then you're in it until you have it paid off, and then you don't have a payment anymore, and now you're cool. It
seems like you're switching sides. It seems like you're coming over to my side of the argument.
What are you talking about? Why do you just make stuff up like that? No, the reason I want to bring that up is because you have to actually look at what you're doing before you can do it well. Before you can do something well, you have to understand what you're doing. So you have to understand you're hedging. People look at it and they go, it's an investment, it's this and that. No, it's not. Yeah. It's only an investment when you go to sell it.
Right.
And unless you're, in an actual investment, you would buy it, and then once it has a certain profit level, you would sell. But you're not going to do that. You're going to sell based on what's going on in your life. Right. So that's not an investment.
Yeah, it's funny to hear all of that, and I know I'm really here to talk about tax, but my own personal experience, I never lived in a house growing up until I was 17 years old. And this whole concept of a house as an investment was really alien to me. The idea, to me, it was a dream to live in, I always lived in apartments. I lived in a housing project for the first 10 years of my life in New York. And then I lived in apartments here in North County until 17 years old when I finally lived in a house in Escondido. So even then it was just a townhouse. I never lived in a single family residence until I was in my 40s. So
wow.
Really, so the whole concept, even though I was a CPA by that time, I understood the business concept of it, but it's still somewhat odd to me that people look at their abode as an investment.
Definitely.
It really, and people often call me and say, well, should I pay my mortgage off? And I would say, well, if you're asking me as a CPA, I could give you these concepts of leverage and how, you can, if your mortgage rate is X and you can actually obtain Y, and the government's underwriting part of your interest rate and so forth, you can even make a bigger return. But then I turn around and say, but I'm not just a machine. This is where you live. This is your house. That should be separate from everything. That should be, so I'm not really a great person to ask in that, because I'm always for trying to be debt-free, at least with that portion of your life, and not have a mortgage if you can avoid it. Sorry to my lender clients out there, but use other assets for leverage and
well, it depends on your personal
ability. Yeah, it's also a matter of personal preference and
for risk
and risk tolerance, etc.
Yeah, because like a lot of guys are like, you know what, hey, let's say I have $1 million cash. I'm going to buy a house that's $1 million. A lot of people would say, finance as much as possible. Others would get more granular and say, you know what, put 20% down so that you can avoid mortgage insurance and lop off some of the crap fees that you might have to pay, which you can afford to not pay, right? So put 20% down, get $800K loan.
Well, now the Internal Revenue Code says otherwise. You put 25.
Oh, yeah, you got to go to 750.
Right.
So you got to go to 750 now to based on how that works. So you want to go to 750, so you put 250,000 down. You take your 750 and you go buy Apple bonds, which pay 5%. Okay, and you get a mortgage for 5%. And this is the part specifically about your point that people don't really understand. They think, well, if I'm making 5% over here and I'm paying 5% over here, it's a wash. That's not true, because you're paying simple interest, right, on the home loan, but you're getting compounding interest on the 5%. So this has a parabolic trajectory, and this has a linear trajectory down. So you're able to, are you okay with that? See, are these words okay with you? So
I'm going back to algebra.
So you have, so when you're making 5% on your money, so it goes from $100, to 105, and then 111,
right?
Because you're getting 5% of 105. So they have that parabolic trajectory over here, and then the linear trajectory over here. And so when you actually look at those over the course of a long period of time, there is a tremendous amount of upside. And as long as you're liquid, you know, you're not buying into some, like a restaurant or, you know, something weird like that. You're just, you know, buying a simple investment like that, like a bond that has a return that you can see, that you can predict. Then it's somewhat liquid. So if you do need the money, or if you have a life event, or if you are like, you know what, screw it, I want to pay my house off.
Right.
You can wait till that thing matures, get it, boom, go pay your house off. So you get to freedom point. We call it the freedom point. Whenever you have enough liquid assets to pay off your mortgage, but you choose not to, because you want to be strategic with the money, you want the money to work for you. Because as we know, when you put your money into the equity of your home, it earns you 0%. I mean, it's just sitting there. It's not doing anything. It's not costing you anything. It's not making you anything. It's just flatlined. And a lot of people want to put their money to work, you know, beyond that. So some people don't, though. Some people, like my grandpa, for example, did not want to owe anyone a dime. He would roll it over in his grave if he had left any debt behind.
Yeah.
So for him, it was, I want to pay my house off as soon as possible, and we will eat ramen noodles once a day, you know,
right.
until this house is paid off, and then we will talk about having 2 meals a day. Like, that's how serious he was about paying off the house. So it depends on personal preference with regard to that. Like, when does it make sense to buy? Here's what's really interesting about it, and this is where you get like time value money calculations and where you really start looking at things. Really, people who've been super successful in real estate are people who buy it really early in life. Like that, you know, I was watching actually a friend of mine who put a video up the other day. He was talking about the first house he bought, and he was just telling this really crazy story, and that was part of it. But he bought his first house at like 19. And I know, and I'm not saying I'm super successful in real estate, but I bought my first house at 21. And I think when you do that, it gives you a better chance for success. If you just, because if you buy a house that early on.
Assuming you can afford the payment.
Assuming, yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Which hopefully.
With other things stacked in there, I agree that that the benefits still outweigh those, the renting versus buying. If you can get into the market, it gives you a chip on the table. I mean, I've talked about the new demographic of buyer, which is the move-up buyer, somebody that's got a lot of equity in their condo, and now they want to sell their condo and buy a bigger house and leverage themselves up. I think so much of that comes from they've got the chip, because otherwise you're jumping into the market and everybody feels like I'm buying in an increasing market, but is it inflated? That's where we get into those discussions. However, somebody else that has purchased in 2012 or 11 or whatever it may be, and it wants to buy a bigger property, they've got equity. So I agree with you.
They get to cash in on it on the sell side.
And now, and again, in this market, there's no entry-level homes to buy. I don't know what you bought when you were 21, but I mean,
it was $185,000 single-story, 2,200 square foot, 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in Columbia, Missouri.
Okay, that's Columbia, Missouri. You know, so I was to say, I have a 23-year-old son here in San Diego in North Park, and there's nothing. You know, he's talked to me about it. There's nothing, and he makes, you know, he's an engineer. He makes relatively good money for somebody just out of college. You can't even consider purchasing a house
right now. No, but now how old is he?
23.
23 today. Okay. So for him, there hasn't really been that chance yet because it's just been such a high market. But if he has it in his mind that, okay, I'm looking, I'm saving, you know, there was opportunities, as we mentioned, 2010, 2011, 2012, where, I mean, I remember at one point, and maybe this was even 2009, there's those studios that are right across from Qualcomm. They're over by, what was that place called? Not McGregor's, that's the Irish place over there. Anyway, they're in Mission Valley. They're not too far from Qualcomm, and they were selling studios for 60 grand.
Yeah.
And they're small, but you know, that's something that like anyone can afford. Now, nowadays, those things are almost 200,000, right? But if people had the mindset of, okay, I want to get in, I'm going to get in early. Yeah. I'm going to, as soon as I can, I'm going to buy something. And it's going to be something I'm going to live in for at least a couple of years and maybe longer until I can figure out what the next move is, but I'm going to get in early. And what a lot of people who do that, especially where I'm from, people buy duplexes. They live on one side, they rent out the other, and then eventually they rent out that side and they buy another duplex, and that's just what they do. Mm-hmm. Here, though, what a lot of people do is they buy a 2-bedroom condo and they rent out the other room to their buddy.
Yeah.
Buddy pays more the mortgage than they do.
Yeah.
You know, and that's also another smart way to go about it. Hey, can I qualify? Okay, get me qualified. Let me get into something and let me figure it out.
And I think that your son is going to have to go through the same challenge and discussion that many people have to go through, which is, do I go to Chula Vista? North Park is where I want to be. It's a happening community. He's walking distance to everything. He can walk to restaurants, etc. But to purchase there, my goodness, it's $900,000 to get anything, it seems like, for a property that was built in 1920 that is 800 square feet. But is he willing to jump into some of the surrounding areas, depending on how far he needs to go, in order to tap into the market? I think that's the challenge. It's kind of our debate that we joke about, is figuring out that whole balance on how much does my life change if I'm 23 and I buy in Santee versus I rent in North Park.
That's the tough thing to figure out, because a lot of people want to rent in North Park.
He's going to have to find a more aggressive accountant.
We aren't quite ready to end the segment, but that would have been the best way to possibly do it. There are some aggressive accountants out there, but you don't want to be on. You don't want to work with them. Trust me. So there are intangibles here. There's certain flexibilities that go along with both. But I think when you talk about when, if you're really going to identify when does it make sense, the sooner the better. And but it may not be possible. You know, like for someone who's 23 years old who's been in this market, it's just been.
Yeah.
It may not be possible for another 6-7 years. So then the question is, what are you doing to prepare for that opportunity? Because I've been out of the market now for several years, but I've been preparing, I've been saving, I've been waiting, I've been looking, I'm paying attention. So I know that in the very near future, that's going to be something I pull the trigger on. But it's also, it's difficult. I've seen market cycles and things like that. So for people who are younger, usually what they're doing is they're just saying, hey, I can afford a condo.
Right.
I saw a house over there. You know, I've seen. So I looked online. I saw something that was this cheap. I think it says the payment's this much. I pay that much in rent, or me and my buddy pay that much in rent. And if I buy it, maybe he'll pay the other half, and they start to figure it out. I know people too who who have bought homes, and I'm like, how in the world did you buy a home? Like, I just don't know how, because I know how much money they make. And I'm just like, how did you buy that place? It's like 600 grand. And there's some crafty stuff you can do. If you get some roommates and you get some leases together, you can put together, like you can buy a 4-bedroom house, rent out 3 rooms, you know, get a couple $1,000 a month coming in, and use that as qualifying income.
Well, let me throw something else out there, if I may,
Please.
About buying a home. There is another part, without getting too complicated in the new tax law. There is the rental end of the spectrum, and the regulations haven't come out yet. But everything, all the commentators that I'm listening to, and everything that I am hearing, if you've been hearing about this new law for businesses, where you're getting a 20% reduction on what they call pass-through income, allegedly rental real estate profit is part of that 20% reduction. So if you are somebody that owns rental property and you are lucky enough to actually have a profit on your rental property, that might make it a good reason to buy property now too, is that if you have a profit, you might be eligible to get that 20% reduction on that profit. So in other words, if you have an $8,000 profit on your rental property, instead of paying tax on $8,000, you would have a $6,400 reportable profit. Totally. Wow. Yeah. So I thought since part of the topic is supposed to be about the new tax,
that's amazing.
I thought I'd throw that out there just to kind of.
Now, is it just on rental properties, or is it on rental income? Because you may have
rental income.
Rental income. Because
rental income. Yeah.
If I own my own home but I rent out the other rooms, or I Airbnb a room or whatever, then that's considered rental income.
And rental income. Yeah. Now I want to caution here before I
no, don't caution. Caution, get out of here.
There's all kinds of codicils depending on what your income is, whether you make over $315,000 a year of taxable income if you're married, and half that if you're single. That's just $157,500 if you're single. There's rules about that, but
it's all just
but
fine
anyway,
print.
Let the tax man figure
anyway,
that out.
since I've got to sit in traffic here on the 805, I thought I'd throw that out there to promote myself. Anyway,
it's a great point.
But we are real
it's a
estate.
great
I was just trying to come up with some other real estate related changes in the tax law.
It's a great point, because how many people do you know who bought a 3-bedroom and Airbnb?
I thought about it when you were talking about rentals. So
one of the bedrooms or both of the other bedrooms. I know several people in the military that I know who bought homes and done that with other people that they know from the military.
Yeah.
You know, I know one lady in particular who actually kind of became famous for this, but he bought a 3-bedroom. It's like just barely qualified for it. Got it. Used the VA loan, 100% financing. Rented out one room to a permanent renter. I was like, never there. It's one of her shipmates, right? And then she was probably never there too. Yeah. And then she Airbnb'd the other room, and like actually made money over the course of like a 3-year period from the rents, where she actually didn't have to pay into it, but you still get your basic allowance for housing.
Yeah. I have a client. I actually met him because he purchased in the condos in Oceanside. He bought the one next door to me, and he was an investor and rented the unit out. He owns about 40 properties in San Diego County. Doesn't own his primary residence because he wants to live on the coast, and he's a numbers guy. I joke with him that he's like Rain Man. Even when you talk to him, he doesn't make eye contact. But he's a numbers guy.
82.
Yeah. And he said, it doesn't pencil for me to purchase a primary residence by the coast. It makes more sense for me to rent by the coast. However, what he likes is investing, because as the market goes up, rents are high. He can look at when to get in and out of the market, where it's harder to do in your primary residence. So there is a demographic that feels like, hey, if you're going to invest in real estate, you got to do it as an investment, not as your primary. And then from there, it's going to open up some doors as the market increases.
And he very well, without looking at the rest of his tax returns, hard to say, but he very well may be one of the great beneficiaries of this new law.
Yeah.
It could very well.
Yeah, because all of his investment properties are not going to be impacted by the changes in property taxes or the property.
Right, and he'll have an increased standard deduction now. I don't know if he's single or married, but even if he's single, it goes from $6,000 to $12,000.
Yeah.
Really? Mm-hmm. Standard deduction for single is $12,000.
Now it is. Yeah, it was $6,000 before.
Can you
annul
it?
That's bonkers.
Well, it's $24,000 for married.
Holy smokes!
But remember, you have at least one child. I heard you talking about. Okay, so you used to get $4,050 for each of you as an exemption. So you have yourself and a wife and a daughter. So that was $13,150 if I'm doing that right. $12,150. No, 4, 8, 12. Yes, what bad accounting there on television. Wonderful.
Gotcha.
$12,150. All right, $12,150 that you lose in exemptions.
But I gained $24,000.
Well, no, you were getting a standard deduction of 12, so that went up to 24.
So it's basically a wash.
More or less, yeah. You actually lost $150.
Oh, come on!
you lost $150. Except for my bad arithmetic.
I thought I was going to be swimming in money.
Except for that's why I use a computer. In bad arithmetic in my head, you would have gained 1,000 in my bad arithmetic, but you lost 150. But so it depends on the person. So you can't generalize. So somebody with no kids, but you have a child. You have a child credit now that you weren't probably able to get before. A larger child credit. Not for larger children.
Tide is turning.
Not larger children, but larger credit.
Larger credit for my small child.
For your small child.
Well, now that everyone agrees with me, I think it's a good time to call it quits. So when does it make sense to buy a home? I would say as soon as you can possibly afford it. Because the sooner you can afford it, the sooner you can be paid off. And if you're buying a home for the right reason, personal, primary residence, you're hedging the market. And if you want to hedge the market, the sooner you can hedge it, the better, because the sooner you own it free and clear, the sooner you are a free bird. Imagine that. No house payment. That's the whole point. So the sooner you can get to that point, the better. Scott, thanks for coming, man.
Pleasure.
Great to see you. Wealth of knowledge. Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
I appreciate you as well. I'm not bringing the wallet in today. I already decided. It's been too many times in a row. If you want to see Steve's huge wallet.
You were shaming my chicken legs before, so...
Off camera. Off camera. I wouldn't do that to you. Great stuff. Share this video. Make your friends smarter than everyone else.